interesting thing about Google is that they started from a place where they swore and they believed that analytics and talent management didn't matter. In workforce analytics, your biggest problem is not the data. It's knowing what question to ask.
Welcome to International Business Today, where we discuss the most critical issues in international business through the lens of cutting-edge research. At Northeastern University, we're committed to disseminating use-inspired research. As academic leaders in the field of international business and strategy, this podcast is dedicated to helping global business professionals get through the noise. We want you to know the facts to make better decisions and policies. I'm Paula Caligiuri, professor at Northeastern University in the International Business and Strategy Group. With me today is my colleague from Northeastern University, distinguished Professor Mark Huselid. Mark is the chair of the International Business and Strategy Group here at Northeastern. He's an expert in global workforce analytics and talent strategy. Mark has some of the most cited work in high-performance work systems, and his books like HR Scorecard, Workforce Analytics, The Differentiated Workforce are among Harvard Business School Publishing's bestsellers. They've been translated into dozens of languages. Mark has consulted with companies around the world and is speaking with us today on some of the most significant changes on the horizon for global workforce analytics. Mark, welcome to International Business Today.
Well, Paula, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So Mark, tell us about this idea of workforce analytics. What is it?
Sure. Yeah. Workforce analytics is really a process. It's a way of managing, understanding, predicting, and controlling the contribution of the workforce to business success. So it's really understanding how and where talent makes a difference.
Yeah, that's so interesting because we think about that more in terms of finances, but really this is about that portfolio of talent.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the uses that you're seeing in companies today on workforce analytics?
Well, absolutely. And for many businesses globally, historically, their measurement systems have focused on physical assets, hard assets, things like buildings and trucks and businesses. And yet, most businesses spend roughly 70% of their total spend on the workforce. So as the world and as value creation becomes much more based on intangible assets, businesses, leaders, and managers really have got a challenge. They've got a problem. They've got an infrastructure that's built around physical assets, but the value is really created through these intangible assets. So the game in workforce analytics is really to try to understand how to manage that process and to figure out where do you invest and disinvest in the workforce.
Wow. And it seems like we don't spend enough time thinking about workforce analytics, right? In most organizations today, it seems as though we spend a lot of time thinking about those tangible assets, yet all the intangible assets that are created through people, through talent. Is this a more is better kind of thing, like more talent is better? Or is it more of a, like you keep saying differentiated? Is there something differentiated about it?
Yeah, and as a corollary, you're right. It's not just more is better, and I think we've all been presented with leaders and managers who say, talent's our most important asset, and people are our most important asset, or our most important assets walk out the door every day, and of course that's true, but yet great leaders and great businesses really know where to differentiate and where to spend, and what roles and places in the business create the most value, because you can't just invest everywhere, and the challenge is to figure out what roles create the most wealth for whatever constituency you have, whether you're a faith-based organization or a for-profit business or a university, and make sure that you're investing in and putting top talent in those roles. And that requires an information architecture and infrastructure. You got to know what's going on, and you got to know what those measures are. And that's what analytics is about.
Yeah. And it seems as though both can be true. You can both believe that people are your most valuable asset, and at the same time understand how how those roles differentially affect how you create wealth in your organization, right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the ways that I think about it is that most organizations, I would argue, underinvest in talent across the board. Maybe I can share a little bit of the history here. My colleagues and I, for 20, 25 years, studied the effects of investments in HR policies and practices on firm performance. And so basically the meta question is, do firms that do a better job managing talent end up with better talent? And does that better talent subsequently create value for shareholders and other people? And the answer is yes and yes. Okay, that's great.
It's a good one for HR,
It's
right?
a good one for
the
HR.
HR function.
And I'll tell you, that was a big question in the 80s and the 90s. I did my first studies on this in 1985 and 86. And so that was really an open question. So the question was, does it matter? And so how much? And so I spent years of my life focusing on those two issues. But when you really peel back the onion and say, well, what does that look like within an organization? And look at how firms are structuring this investment, what you see is that firms do disproportionately invest in talent, but they disproportionately invest in talent at the most senior level. Mm-hmm. And so what does that mean? Is that the senior executives get most of the resources, the best training, the best resources, the best coaching across the board. More pay, more variable pay, all across the board. Well, it's hard to argue that that's a bad thing because these leaders and managers, senior executives, they're rare, they're valuable, and they're making decisions that affect all kinds of people in the business. So would never say you would want to take that away. But when you disproportionately focus on the top of the house, think of what you're not doing. And the metaphor that I use, and I think about an Olympic swimming team. Not that I've ever coached an Olympic swimming team, but if you think about what it takes to end up as a senior executive or as a swimmer on the Olympic team, you're so good and so well developed and so well coached over many, many years. It's exceptionally difficult to improve the performance of that team by 1 or 2%, let alone 15 or 20%. But think about an 8th grade swim team, where you've got kids, how old you are in 8th grade, 13 years old, but the variance in performance is really very significant. You've got people who have been swimmers for years. You've got people that have never swum before, right? And so investment in talent there, coaching, training, focused interventions can have enormous impact on team performance. And any of us who've ever coached Little League or something like that, you realize from the beginning to the end of the year, there's an enormous shift that's not just maturation, but it's the effects of coaching. So what does that mean? In many organizations, and we find this over and over again, the opportunities for investment in talent are significant at each level, but they're disproportionately important at lower or mid levels in the organization. So that 28-year-old program manager who's never had a developmental opportunity, right? If we could find her and help her and coach her, and most importantly, and here's the analytics tie-in, measure where she is and what she's doing and what she needs to go next, that's the enormous win. So the return on investment, it turns out, for investments at lower levels in the organization are actually much higher than they are at the higher end, because that's where the variance is. Sure. And that's what analytics is about, is understanding where the variance is.
Oh, it's so fascinating, right? Exactly as you described it. It's the wider variance down at the lower levels of the organization, but also kind of doing the analytics around which roles, when invested, when we spend some time investing and some resources investing in talent, could make the greatest difference in our firm. Mark, have you seen a global organization that's doing this really well?
Well, I think there's many, and it's taken off like a house on fire over the last few years for a lot of different reasons. The pandemic has really shifted many things in high gear because the work from home kind of trend has really made the analytics issues very salient, because leaders and managers are saying, wait a minute, where is she? What is she doing? How is she coaching? All of those kinds of things have come up in new and different ways that weren't there before. So one classical example that you'll see a lot of writing about is Google. As you might imagine, has a very well-developed internal analytics system. The interesting thing about Google is that they started from a place where they swore and they believed that analytics and talent management didn't matter, right?
You're kidding.
No,
Oh, I
no.
didn't know that.
Their presenting hypothesis was that the effect was zero. Wait a minute, how's that possible? Well, their argument was, our selection ratio. We are so is close to zero. We can get anybody we want. We've got the best of everything. All we need to do is get leaders and managers out of the programmers' way and let them run. Well, the executive team and the HR team there challenged that thinking and said, let us collect some data, which is what they did, a very empirical, quantitative approach. And what they found, a short and a long story, is that firms, leaders, project teams globally that had better coaches, better managers, more thoughtful interactions did significantly better. So even with the best of the best, talent matters. And so for me, I'm thinking, think of it. What about the rest of us?
Right.
The effect would be much, much larger. So Google's one. Most of the Fortune 50s have significant kind of leadership and analytics teams that often put together people from finance, accounting, marketing, and so on to focus on the talent-related issues.
It's so great that these experts in workforce analytics, they know how to ask the right questions.
Right.
Isn't that a fundamental piece of this, is really understanding which questions you need to ask, right?
Well, that's absolutely right. I always say that, in workforce analytics, your biggest problem is not the data. It's knowing what question to ask. I think Einstein said, in essence, the same thing many, many, many years ago. But, solving the analytics problem effectively, I think, has three parts to it. The first is asking the right question. The second, and that's the easiest part, the second part is collecting and analyzing the right data. And the third part, which you don't often hear much about, is influencing the right decisions.
Let's talk about that, because that idea,
Yeah.
I can see how all three parts matter, but influencing the right decisions, what does that mean, and where have you seen that?
Yeah, it's the inference in this literature or in the community broadly is that all we need are better workforce analytics, and if we could just make this case, doors would open and things would be fine. But we know, I think, from a lot of different research, social science and otherwise, and just life in general, that just having data, it doesn't necessarily kind of change things, right? If all it took were data to drive an answer, many of the world's ills would be solved, and we could kind of go down a list. So the point I make is that you really have to sell your answer. You have to think in terms of placing analytics in a change management protocol and a process, because in essence, especially around workforce analytics, sometimes the answers you're bringing to the organization are not what they want to hear, right? Because that's the challenge of analytics, is that there's grades involved, right? And it's not just that everyone is doing great, is that we have challenges here. We need to make changes. We need to make new and different investments. So having that process and having people on the team with the team that are able to articulate that change management story, right, whether it's data visualization, storytelling, all of it
Data
matters a lot.
visualization,
Yeah.
storytelling, those are the two, right, that we need in order to be able to communicate these data. So,
Yeah,
have
absolutely.
you seen a lot of this?
Yeah, there's lots of businesses that do that. There's lots of software systems and protocols that do that, where there's beautiful graphs and storytelling. Now, a great graph isn't going to get you over
Fundamentals
a bad.
of persuasion isn't
Yeah,
just
that's
the graph,
right. Right.
It seems as though people who are great in these organizations at workforce analytics, they know how to ask the right questions. Is that a big component of this?
Well, it certainly is, and I think Einstein said that years ago, and it's absolutely true. I think there's three components. So asking the right questions is key and central and first. But the second part is collecting and analyzing the right data, which is actually the easiest part of the process, ironically, for a workforce analytics guy to say that, I think is a little much. But the third part, which I think doesn't get a lot of discussion, is about influencing the right decisions. Just because we've got the right question and we've got the right data doesn't mean we've changed anything in our organization, whatever organization it is. So we've got to think as change leaders, as change managers, and embed our answers in ways the organization can accept and understand and find helpful and useful. Showing up with a series of regression equations and tables isn't necessarily going to get us there,
Oh,
right?
it hurts an academic to hear that, right?
It just
right.
kills us, right? So,
But
it's
we
data
know.
visualizations, storytelling, all those kinds of things matter a lot.
It's the fundamentals of persuasion, right? This data visualization and storytelling and being able to influence
Right.
with data. So critical.
Yep.
So Mark, are you seeing a differential use of workforce analytics around the world? I know your books are translated into languages and you work all over the world, but are you seeing some countries using this more than others?
Well, it's a great question. There's huge cultural differences in acceptability and desire and want for data. I mean, some cultures find feedback around talent and people needed and accepted. Others find it kind of frankly offensive and not okay. In Europe, for example, there are many challenges around data collection and analysis, and there's basically
data
the right,
privacy?
the data privacy. The right to be forgotten. Who owns the data, and what can you collect, and how can you use it? These are real challenges that in the United States has not been an issue historically. But some folks think that there will be a global standard around data privacy, which creates some real challenges for us if, for example, we can't collect and keep data over time. Once we leave, do I have the right to be forgotten at my job? Can I require you to delete everything that's associated with where I was coached, where I was trained, my performance management? So it's a big deal.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can imagine that there's so much embedded here in every system, right? The legal system, the talent systems, the cultural differences. There's a lot going on from country to country. So what's next? What do you think is on the horizon for workforce analytics? It's such an exciting area, and like you said, since COVID, we're paying more attention to just focusing on the work people are doing as opposed to
Right.
where they do it.
Right.
What else? What's on the horizon?
Yeah, I wish I knew completely. I can tell you what I think I know, which is you'll see more digitization of everything. I mean, we know that. All businesses are focusing on digital. As part of that, the ERP providers, the SAP, the Lawsons, the Oracles, the Workday, and so on, the companies that create software systems to collect and propagate data are growing significantly, and so there's certainly a sense that this is where things are going. There's a real challenge with that, is that as data collection becomes more standardized, it becomes more ubiquitous. This uniqueness that we've talked about, we might run up against a wall here. Do you see what I'm saying here?
Yeah.
If it's not in the data set, we're
That's
not going to
interesting.
spend money to collect data. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that that's the challenge that is quite different than instrumenting finance or accounting or
Right.
supply chain. It's much more bespoke or idiosyncratic around talent because there's people involved.
Right, and it's strategic to its core, right? So we need the leaders within the organizations using those systems as a tool, not the other way around. The tools
Absolutely.
dictating what those strategic analytics should be. That's such an interesting and important
All well
area.
said. Absolutely.
Such
Yeah.
a critical area. So, Mark, where do people learn to become effective at this, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
want people who know workforce analytics and understand them so they
Right.
can influence these ERPs in a way that makes sense for their organization uniquely. How do people learn this?
It's interesting. If one was an accountant in an organization, one would expect this person to have an accounting degree. Most of the folks in finance have background in finance. Marketing professionals typically tend to have marketing degrees. In HR, the backgrounds tend to be much broader. So folks come from social sciences, they come from STEM, they come from all over the place. So there's not necessarily as broad or as accepted a common body of knowledge in this area. At the same time, the competencies it requires to pull this off are pretty broad. You think about those three issues we talked about, asking the right question. That means you need to know the background in finance. You need to know the background in HR. You need to know the literature. The data piece, you need to know some things about statistics. You need to know some things about data science, computational sciences, those kinds of things. And then finally, the bucket around change management. Well, there's a whole broader set of issues. So people that do this, I mean, people talk about unicorns, people that are able to do all of these things, just as rare in workforce analytics as they are in the real world. Great analytics teams tend to be just that. They tend to be multifunction teams that have people from different disciplines that come together to solve a problem. And you're doing the analytics piece, and I'm doing maybe the change management piece, whatever it is. But we work together. So there are lots of programs. There's lots of degrees. They tend to be advanced degrees, master's degrees in analytics. But you're starting to see globally undergraduate degrees in analytics as well, both in computer science and in business schools.
Boy, and it's so critical, like you said, the idea of a team. I've always said HR is such a technical function. I mean, there's a lot of technical skills to know. And so to do this well, the idea of working collectively as a team, everybody bringing their piece of the equation. But there's also centers like yours. You run the Center for Workforce Analytics here at Northeastern University. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how someone could maybe connect with it?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I've had the great, good privilege of working in this space for a long time. My whole professional career, it's all I've ever done is basically analytics at some level. So fortunately, I've gotten to know lots of people out there. So we have a group of mostly Fortune 50 companies, that come together and talk about these issues. And as the pandemic is ending, we're looking forward to having more in-person kinds of things. So I think we're all looking forward to that quite a bit. So send us a note. Send me a note. There's a web page. You can look at Center for Workforce Analytics at Northeastern. Our DMSB, our business school, there's a link there as well, and there's more information about our department as well as the center and the group that we have.
So, Mark, it seems like there's a lot of terms out there. We hear workforce analytics, HR strategy, people analytics. What are these all the same thing, or are they different?
Boy, that's a great question, and there are a lot of terms out there. We've actually collected some data on this and done some digging around and that. And so, what are the terms? HR analytics is popular, as is workforce analytics, as you mentioned, as is people analytics. In the literature and among managers and leaders, they tend to be synonyms. They tend to take them as the same. However, if you talk to a leader and manager and present her with those three things, she has a different reaction to each one of them.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
So, for example, if I say I'm working on a project in HR analytics, the assumption is they don't think workforce first. They think, oh, you're going to analyze the HR function.
Oh, interesting.
You're going to figure out whether or not we're efficient or what our cost per hire is, for example. Workforce analytics tends to be a broader term and tends to be unambiguous in that people know, oh yeah, you're talking about the workforce, you're talking about talent, right? That's the term I tend to prefer. The third term is really interesting, the people analytics. That is actually in Europe and other places got a lot of kickback and pushback. Why? Well, because are you analyzing people?
Oh,
you see,
personal.
too very personal,
Private.
right? Where's workforce, that
Infringement
term,
on privacy.
yeah. So again, depending on who you talk to, there'll be there are jobs in HR analytics, workforce analytics, and people analytics that are virtually doing the same thing. But in the main, they tend to have a different meaning among constituencies.
I'm with you, and I'm with the data. I really like the workforce analytics as the marker to talk about how strategy interacts with human talent and also the analytics field. So.
But just be recognize when you're out there that different people think about these things differently, and that's okay.
Right.
But there are huge cultural differences in this one.
I will definitely link to that. Mark, thank you so much for being on International Business Today. This was such an interesting conversation. Thank you.
just a pleasure. Thank you.
To our listeners, thank you for being a part of International Business Today. If you benefited from today's episode, please subscribe to it and share with anyone who might benefit from this cutting-edge knowledge. Thank you.